Boa tarde a todos. Estamos começando a parte substantiva do evento agora, com apresentações, keynote speakers, painéis, e eu tenho, digamos, a honra e o prazer de estar abrindo aí o primeiro painel com o Bertrand de la Chapelle, uma pessoa brilhante, uma honra tê-lo aqui com a gente. Eu tive a sorte de conhecê-lo há bastante tempo nas reuniões de internet que tivemos pelo mundo. Ele foi membro do board da ICANN, ele esteve no ISIS 2002, em suma, foi do GAC, foi do IGF, ele tem uma enorme participação na internet e ele tem uma qualidade muito especial, que é uma pessoa extremamente sensata e razoável nessa área de internet, o que não é muito comum, porque a internet é uma coisa tão diversa, né? Uma coxa de retalhos tão ampla, que é muito difícil a gente ter um caminho que seja equilibrado e que seja, digamos, viável para a gente chegar do outro lado. Então, nós vivemos no meio de angústias, de ataques a dados, de fraudes, de crimes, de problemas, e às vezes perdemos, digamos, o caminho sensato, o bom caminho, que nos levará a alguma coisa mais segura, que nos levará a uma internet mais saudável, a uma internet mais útil para todos nós. Então, o Bertrand é um sujeito de múltipla formação, ele acho que começou na área de engenharia, no Politécnico, na Escola Politécnica da França, e depois teve, digamos, na área de humanidades e foi embaixador da França e teve uma porção de atuação nesse processo. E ele carrega uma enorme bagagem, inclusive porque ele é o mentor do Internet Jurisdiction, que é, digamos, um órgão exatamente no espírito internet, né? Um espírito multissetorial. Aliás, só para falar em multissetorial, eu me lembro de uma apresentação dele acho que numa entrevista que ele deu na ICANN de Praga, não sei agora, em 2012, 13, por aí, em que ele comentava que essa história do multissetorialismo, de você ter todo mundo ao redor de um tema, era mais ou menos uma ruptura tão importante quanto foi, digamos, o voto universal que foi trazido um dia para as comunidades. Não, todos têm que votar para escolher seus dirigentes. Agora, na nova versão da internet, todos têm que dar palpite para onde esse negócio vai, para onde nós levaremos a internet. E, especificamente, nessa parte da Internet Jurisdiction, ele tem uma iniciativa dividida em 3 fluxos importantes. Um fluxo que cuida da proteção de privacidade de dados e como é que você cuida da disseminação dos dados transfronteiras, etc. e tal. Uma outra que trata mais de conteúdo no sentido mais explícito de direitos autorais e coisas assim, e uma outra que trata de domínios, que também é um ramo importante na internet, porque, em geral, a velha situação de quando você só... Tem uma frase velha que o Mandic usava, dizia que quando você só tem um martelo, todos os problemas seus parecem pregos. Então, a gente tem uma tendência na internet a tentar resolver as coisas pelo método mais curto, que, em geral, traz mais efeitos colaterais do que soluções. Então, nesse ponto, o Bertrand tem uma abordagem muito sensata, no sentido de que não devemos procurar soluções atabalhoadas e rápidas que não vão nos levar, digamos, a um lugar melhor do que estávamos, pode até nos levar a um lugar pior. Então, nesse primeiro keynote, nessa primeira palestra dele, ele vai tratar do problema de dados. Temos que falar sobre dados. Eles têm uma iniciativa legal lá chamada Datasphere, a esfera de dados, como é que você trata da história dos dados, porque isso é uma coisa multifacetada. Os dados são pessoais, existem dados de país, né? Países que existem desde a época da Convenção de Westfália, que são direitos nacionais, etc. e tal, mas existem os direitos individuais. Eu certamente posso trocar meus dados com um colega que está em outro lugar do mundo, é um direito meu. Por outro lado, o país tem que proteger os dados nacionais, são estratégicos para comércio, para indústria, para o diabo 4. Então, essa é uma abordagem multifacetada que precisa ser feita com muito juízo e muito cuidado, e o Bertrand nos dará luzes sobre isso ao abordar como trataremos o problema de dados hoje. Essa economia baseada em dados, essa economia baseada em atenção, que atualmente digamos, prevalente na internet e que gostaríamos que fosse devidamente amenizada ou civilizada para que todos pudéssemos manter nossa proteção à privacidade, proteção aos nossos direitos, proteção à nossa liberdade e proteção à internet dentro dos princípios que o CG defendeu no seu decálogo e que, de alguma forma, foram também marcados no Marco Civil e na LGPD. Então, como falei, para mim, uma grande honra e alegria reencontrar o Bertrand depois de bastante tempo das velhas reuniões da internet. Como ele mesmo comentou, somos colegas de cachimbo, precisamos uma cachimbada de vez em quando, e eu fico muito feliz de reencontrá-lo e passo a ele para fazer uma exposição sobre qual é o nosso cenário de dados atualmente e como como encontraremos o caminho para poder evoluir sem perder o que foi conquistado e sem aumentar o número de riscos e ameaças a todos nós. Muito obrigado, Bertrand. A palavra está com você. Obrigado por ter atendido ao convite.
Thank you so much, Demi. Indeed, we go back a long time, and apart from being pipe smokers, we have participated in processes, as he mentioned, for almost 20 years now. And the evolution of the landscape is not very pleasant, actually, for people who have been involved that much, because some of the trends are, let's be honest, and I'll come back to that, a little bit worrisome. You said it's an honor to have me, but I would reciprocate. It's always an amazing pleasure to interact with people from CGI and NIC.br and friends in Brazil. And I tremendously respect the work that is being done there. And I hope that I will basically abide by the presentation that he kindly made regarding my desire to be balanced and to portray the different perspective. The Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network is something that I created in 2012 with the aim and from the starting point of considering that you cannot address issues that are transnational without having all the different actors that are concerned by the issue around the same table. So what we're going to talk about today is specifically about the question of data, and I want to start basically with a rapid run through the main messages that were in the report that we produced in April of this year, and also to give a glimpse of what we are trying to do at the moment with this data sphere initiative to try to provide a different conceptual framework to how we address the question of data across borders. So I will share my screen, and I hope everything works properly, but it should be the case. Let me do this. Does everybody see it properly? Okay, so that's wonderful. So basically, the idea that we're starting from in the title of this presentation is we need to talk about data, which basically is about the report that I mentioned that we launched in April of this year. It was actually supported and made possible by a grant from the German Ministry of Economy and Energy. And it was presented at a conference that we co-organized with the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Information, the METI. And the structure of the report is extremely simple. There's no way to do it more simply. The goal is to frame the debate between the free flow of data and data sovereignty, two expressions that are very polarized at the moment and that basically lead to what I've sometimes described as people in trenches on each side that are lobbing grenades at each other behind a little bit too radical slogans. And so the structure is very simple. The report was organized around those 4 points. It is about data, about free flow of data, about data sovereignty and how to move forward. And in the final element, I will describe a little bit what we're doing around the data sphere, which is an exciting initiative that we're launching right now. So first part on data, because we cannot talk about something without exploring a little bit what it is. And so there are a few things, and one of the characteristics of the report is that it has nice graphics that we spent quite some time doing with a very nice designer from Asia. And there are four points on this issue of data itself. The first one is that when we are confronted with the unfamiliar, which is the case in everything we're talking about, we have a tendency to rely on analogies. And analogies are really good, and you have heard so many of them around data. Data is the new oil, data is the new power, that is the new water, new currency. whatever. The problem is that it helps us get to the familiar, but at the same time, although each of the different analogies provide useful insights, if you rely too literally on the analogies, you draw policy conclusions that can be extremely misguided. And we have to be very cautious when we use analogy, and I send a very strong warning, particularly regarding the overuse at the moment of the expression data is the new oil, and we can discuss that further. The second element when we talk about data is that it is multidimensional. Demi mentioned it. Yes, there is private data, personal data, but there is also an enormous amount of non-personal data. And in between, a lot of things that can be non-personal, but that can become personal and vice versa. And what is important is that not only is the data production growing tremendously at speeds that are unprecedented, there are also many, many ways to classify data. It can be by the sector that they come from. It can be of the nature of the data, whether it is numerical data, semantic data. And actually, the classification boundaries, as I said, are quite blurry and overlapping. And the most important element is the notion of value chains, because data goes from completely raw data to very sophisticatedly analyzed data for decision making, and in between so many steps where it is used and reused by different actors. So the importance of value chains and complex value chains is very important. The next thing is that we're not familiar with the way data functions. It is different from goods and services because it is a non-finite resource. It constantly grows. It is durable, and it is strangely non-rivalrous, which means that my use of the data doesn't prevent somebody else to use it. But at the same time, it is excludable, which is in the category of goods and services, is a very strange category because you can impose restrictions on the access or the reuse of data. There are many ways to generate value in the data-driven economy, and the data that is valuable for somebody may be without particular value to somebody else. And in that regard, the fact that the value chains of data are non-linear is extremely important. Like, you can have very strong bumps of value that can be brought to the use of data by a minor change, because you just have one additional piece of information that makes sense of data that otherwise would be gibberish. Typical example is you can have something that is encrypted. If you don't have the key, you cannot do anything about this data set. But if you have just the key to decrypt, suddenly the data brings its whole value. And finally, in the unusual properties, there are many, many externalities, as we say in economy, and they can be positive or negative. You can have the use of data in one particular sector, and the improvements that it brings to that sector actually have very positive effects somewhere else. But on the other hand, as we see about the whole debate regarding the impact of social media on democracies, for instance, just the change in an algorithm can have societal impacts and externalities on the fabric of society itself. Finally, sorry, I'm moving too fast. There's a final element which is extremely important, which is that there is an enormous focus at the moment on the location of the storage and the processing of data. And it is important to highlight that it is not only what matters. Of course, it may matter, but it is only one part of the picture. And actually, who collects or processes data, from whom and for whom, is almost, if not more relevant, as is the question of the purpose and the use of the data. Because the same data can be used for very positive reasons, collected for very positive reasons, but also used for very nefarious situations. The Cambridge Analytica scandal was a perfect illustration of that. So that is the first part regarding data itself. We need to understand that data functions differently from goods and services. Now, the second question is, if you look at the notion of free flow of data, we have likewise a certain number of important elements. The first one is that the expression free flow of data has a huge shadow above it that is related to the free trade debate. And the picture here illustrates the balance between the debate between free trade and fair trade. And historically, free trade is advocated to maximize the wealth of nations. But even if it is a concept that seems very natural, we still need pretty complex frameworks to reduce the barriers to trade, because the starting point is not the free flow of goods and services. The starting point is actually a lot of barriers to trade. The other element regarding the free trade debate is that there are global value chains that across the world trigger strong interdependencies. This is true for trade, and it is extremely true for data as well. But the problem is that because of a certain number of socioeconomic dynamics and the unbalances that the society has witnessed in the environment of trade, there is a sort of backlash against free trade at the moment regarding how fair it is, what inequalities it brings. And this is the shadow that is above the debate around the notion of the free flow of data. The second thing is that the topic of free flow of data is very high on the global policy agendas. I don't get into the details, but we need to think about one important element, which is that the free flow of data is the technical default on the internet. Unlike for trade and goods and services that cross borders physically, data by nature has been flowing on the internet because the infrastructure of the internet itself is ageographic. And we have at the moment in the international fora very intense policy debates about free flow of data. It is difficult to integrate this strange new resource in traditional trade negotiations because, as I said before, data functions differently from goods and services. And there's also a very big challenge, which is it is extremely difficult to measure the flows of value. We already do not have good metrics for the flow of data itself, but measuring the flow of value is extremely difficult, and everybody's struggling with this, even if some organizations, such as the OECD, for instance, are trying to work on this. In that regard, we have the shadow of the free trade debate. We have international discussions, and you know that this is present in the WTO, in the OECD, and in many other fora. There are real concerns that have emerged about our data society. And they actually overlap the three dimensions that we mention here: economy, human rights, and security. The fact is that the interdependence issue is even faster on data than it is on goods and services. And this has raised a certain number of issues regarding security concerns, attacks and overuse of data, data leaks, etc. But there are also economic concerns regarding the imbalance between different countries or within countries, between different categories of the population, and the fact that a certain number of companies have achieved an enormously massive influence in the world and in the global economy is raising concerns regarding antitrust, monopoly positions, imbalances, and the capacity of specific countries to affirm their labor market and so on. But there are also human rights and broader societal concerns human rights, one of them is the right to privacy. And we are here in a session that is connected to the question of privacy. But there are also broader social and societal concerns regarding the evolution of our societies, our democracies, and the violence, hate speech, etc. And I would add a final point regarding the concerns, which once again are legitimate and have to be taken into account, is that the speed of adaptation is much faster than whatever we experienced in the transition to the Industrial Revolution. So the speed of adaptation is a concern in itself because it is extremely hard for regulatory environments to catch up with the changes and the technical evolution. And the final element regarding the free flow of data issue is that trust is a fundamental issue. And we need at the same time to preserve the default of the free transit at the technical layer, but at the same time building trust and responsibility about uses and misuses. And this is difficult because we don't have a lot of spaces where this can be discussed easily. And I would say that when we say cross-border, we're talking not only about the political borders, but we're also talking about what could be labeled as virtual borders between companies, for instance, or between the spaces of a very large cloud providers or social media platforms, for instance. So the whole debate about free flow of data has given birth to an expression that Japan has pushed, particularly on the agenda of the G7 and the G20, which is the notion of free flow of data with trust. If we go to the next topic, which is data sovereignty, there we have a certain number of problems. Because without belaboring too much, there are concrete challenges to the notion that sovereignty is based fundamentally on the territory. This is the traditional understanding of sovereignty historically. It is also the foundational principle of our international system. It's a community of separate nation states with jurisdiction over their own territory, and the principle of non-interference. But at the same time, we have different variations, and there are real challenges that are brought by the digital age. And the reason why we put a picture with a telescope is because the analogy is that just like the telescope by Galileo produced the change basically between the Ptolemaic astronomic system and the Copernican system, I strongly believe that the internet and the data economy is putting a similar challenge to the traditional intergovernmental, territorially based system of sovereignties. And the problem is that there is at the moment, and that's the second point, a presentation of this concept of data sovereignty as a sort of panacea to solve all the different concerns that I had before. And it is a multifaceted notion that is explained and perceived in very different and sometimes conflicting ways by different types of actors. It's basically, and it's understandable, a reaction by states to a sense of loss of control. We have a cloud of related concepts. It can be data sovereignty, strategic independence, it can be digital sovereignty. A lot of words are coming around this, but what is important is that under this umbrella of data sovereignty, there are many objectives that the different political entities want to address. And interestingly enough, the concept of data sovereignty is even used sometimes by the operators of cloud themselves to explain that they will leave their users with a form of sovereignty. And there is a notion that is emerging, which is digital self-determination, which is pushed, for instance, by Switzerland, which shows that the concept of sovereignty is moving. Just like I said, there are virtual territories. The concept of sovereignty in the digital age needs to be exercised in a different way. And data sovereignty means very different things for different people. The problem, and that's the third point, is that there are a lot of implementation pitfalls in the concept of data sovereignty. You have a diversified arsenal of data sovereignty measures. I won't get into the details, but it's in the report. And as always, the devil of implementation is always in the details, because you can have a measure that on paper looks good, but that has a lot of unintended consequences. And jokingly in the report, we say unintended consequences are to be anticipated in a certain way. The way we address the problem at the moment, we don't know what the consequences will be, but there will be consequences that we don't really anticipate right now. And more importantly, if measures about data sovereignty are generalized, and if everybody adopts it or adopts them around the world, then there are systemic impact. It's a little bit, sorry to be pedantic, but it's a little bit like the Kantian imperative of what would happen if what you envisage to do were done by everybody else. Would that be a good thing or not? So there is a form of responsibility in the exercise of sovereignty dealing with data that needs to take into account the impact that any national measure, especially if it is extraterritorial, has on other actors. And finally, in that regard, we have to deal structurally with multiple jurisdictions, because data has usually a plurality of territorial nexus, be it where it's collected, where it's used, who processes it. And that means a huge overlap of applicable rules. And we need to think about not only the rights of states, but also the responsibilities of states. And in a certain way, we should put forward a question of responsible sovereignty, responsible self-organization. And fundamentally, the question is who sets the rules? And I should have mentioned before that we are in a situation of normative plurality, because not only the states, but also massive platforms are also having an influence in setting the rules. So in that context, you have two concepts. The free flow of data goes with a certain number of legitimate concerns. And on the other hand, the notion of data sovereignty tries to address those concerns, but in a way that is so generic and with so many implementation pitfalls that this is not a very comfortable situation, and it's even a dangerous one, to be frank. So in line with what Demi was saying, there is an element of going beyond the dichotomy and moving forward. So we need a few things, and that was the core final message of the report. We need a multi-stakeholder debate with all the voices that is global, but that is most importantly across silos. Because at the moment, all the different issues about data are addressed in different spaces with different angles and different types of stakeholders. The second thing is we need a more nuanced discussion, and we need to define common objectives. We need to really socialize that it is a complex issue. And for people who are familiar with the scientific field of complex dynamic systems, the architecture of data, and I will come to it, the data sphere, is basically a complex dynamic system. Caution is extremely needed, and we need common objectives to guide efforts. And one of the key common objectives is not only to address the concrete issues, but also to have the goal of maximizing the social and economic value creation, and to properly define the distribution of responsibility. So a global debate, a nuanced discussion and common objectives, and most importantly, we need innovation. Interestingly enough, when we presented the report with Japan, there was, at the same time, and it was intended, another report by Japan on the notion of governance innovation. And so we have this general idea that we need innovations in technical solutions, in normative frameworks and concepts, so that we have interactions between silos, we have experimentation to move forward. And so in this regard, I want to finish with an introduction of this notion that emerged while we were doing the report, which is the notion of the data sphere. And so the concept of the data sphere and the approach that we're trying to put forward is very simple. One, as written here, the trajectory of our data-driven societies is worrisome. The problems that we encounter, they're not new. They've been social problems for a long time. They're just amplified by the digital transition. And we have a lot of uncoordinated actions and approaches that make the problem worse and increase the tensions. The second element is this sense of loss of control in the trajectory of our societies can only be addressed if we have a higher purpose or a higher level objective. And we believe that this higher objective is well-being for all in terms of maximizing the social and economic value creation and its equitable distribution with an appropriate space for discussing this. And the way to do this is, we believe, to address the fact that the territorial approach has limits. And I was mentioning something in an audition for a commission that has been set up in France. The bottom line is the states that focus exclusively on the territorial or territory-determined dimension of their sovereignty will not have the capacity to exercise it fully. And we need a new perspective. We need a new conceptual framework, and we believe that the data sphere, like the entire collection of data and the interactions with people, will provide it. So the bottom line is that how we will govern the data sphere is absolutely essential for the future of our societies in the 21st century. It is one of the core elements because we need it to address almost any problem, including the SDGs, including climate change, and including the creation of value and both social and economic. And so this is why we're creating and incubating at the moment inside Internet and Jurisdiction a data sphere initiative. And the goal is to focus on governance frameworks so that they are inclusive, agile, and scalable to bring a data sphere that fosters trust, prosperity, sustainability, and well-being for all. I think it's a final element, and here are the three key objectives. But what is important is that it is a holistic, it's a systemic approach, and most importantly, we believe that it is a positive approach that we need today, because we need to have something that is an ambition, not something that is just trying to look backwards and address the problems that are emerging one after the other. And this ambition is well-being for all. And the three activities are basically organizing this global dialogue, raising awareness by careful sectoral studies and thematic analysis, but most importantly, enable the exploration of not only policy, but also institutional innovations. And the end result is that we hope, after the incubation period, to launch formally a self-standing structure around the Data Sphere Initiative. And I couldn't resist at the end to put the two quotes, one that is well known from Kofi Annan, that dates back to 2004, that basically says we need to be as inventive or as innovative as the people who invented the internet to organize its governance. And by the way, Windsurf, in one of our conferences, said that organizing the coexistence of different legislations on the digital space is more complex than inventing the internet itself. But the final quote is one that I really deeply relate to, which is: a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in human. This is from Nobel Prize winner in economics, Elinor Ostrom. And for the anecdote, it was on the wall of one of the rooms in which we held the third global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in Berlin in 2019. And I think it fits remarkably with what we've been trying to do, and particularly in the Datasphere Initiative. And so if you want more information and be kept abreast of the work, there's a preliminary website, which is thedatasphere.org, where you can find more information. Voila. I've been significantly longer than what I was allotted, but it was a lot to cover, and I hope that it was fulfilling the goal that Demi had put forward.
Excellent presentation. Eu vou voltar ao português, sorry. Voltando ao português aqui para manter aqui a coerência, como eu falei antes. Eu acho que essa é uma discussão extremamente ampla, extremamente complexa. E eu vou começar com algumas perguntas provocativas para o Bertrand, enquanto esperamos mais perguntas da audiência, e bem-vindo aí. E a primeira delas, eu acho que falta para essa discussão, na minha opinião, uma taxonomia mais clara. Então, por exemplo, certamente as fronteiras nacionais, como bem falou o Bertrand, já foram, digamos, ultrapassadas na época do telegrama, do telefone, né, e outros meios, o correio eletrônico, com certeza. Então, certamente a informação individual que vai além das fronteiras já passou há muito tempo disso aí. Então, isso talvez não seja uma novidade, a escala que a internet traz é uma novidade, e a internet traz uma coisa adicional, que é jardins murados ou plataformas, como queiram, que usam isso para, digamos, prosperar e para evoluir de uma forma que não é a velha forma do correio e do telefone. Então, quando nós falamos que existem, digamos, ligações territoriais de direitos e deveres, eu queria saber até onde isso vai e onde isso descola. Então, vou dar um exemplo. Quando a gente fala de mensageria, por exemplo, eu acho que a proteção à privacidade deve ser perfeita, total, e ninguém deve interferir nisso. Eu jamais esperaria que uma carta minha impressa nos velhos tempos fosse lida por alguém do serviço de correios. Da mesma forma que eu espero que o meu telefonema a alguém não seja interceptado por ninguém, exceto se houver uma ordem judicial, etc. Mas isso é uma mensageria entre indivíduos. E aí eu acho que, inclusive, as fronteiras não devem importar. Eu posso fazer isso com qualquer pessoa de qualquer lugar do mundo, a meu talante, a minha descrição. Porém, quando você entra em situações em que a coisa vai para broadcast, ou para comunicação de um para N, ou de um para muitos, e onde a comunidade é algo difuso, evidentemente que o risco é maior e você tem que tomar cuidado com o que acontece com esses dados. Você pode estar invadindo esferas que não são suas, você pode eventualmente estar sujeito, de fato, a um monitoramento ou não, porque você está numa... É diferente de eu mandar um e-mail para alguém e eu botar um pôster no meio de uma praça pública que tem conteúdo abusivo. Então, a primeira coisa que eu acho que falta aqui para a nossa discussão ampla, acho perfeita essa iniciativa do Bertrand, mas para comentar algo que me daria conforto, seria primeiro tentar uma taxonomia que dividisse, escalonasse, qualificasse o que são dados pessoais que têm que ser privados, o que são dados que não são pessoais e que podem ser monitorados ou investigados ou públicos, o que são dados que precisam ser abertos para o bem geral. Em suma, tem um monte, eu vou lembrar de alguns comentários, por exemplo, que um documento bom do Internet Jurisdiction sobre a pandemia, a Covid-19, comenta sobre dados, quer dizer, que dados teoricamente são bons serem acompanhados porque são de interesse de saúde pública, mas sem invadir a privacidade, o que são dados anonimizados. Em suma, eu acho que podíamos ter uma discussão completa e ampla em tentar colocar uma taxonomia, porque quando a gente fala a internet, eu já falei isso mais de uma vez, a internet não é a internet que o Windsurf criou, como bem foi dito aqui. A internet que o Windsurf criou é uma internet que eu pretendo seja sempre única, universal, não rompida, que atinja a todos. Isto não se espalha adequadamente às construções sobre ela. As construções sobre ela podem ser boas ou ruins, podem estar ou não sujeitas à legislação nacional. Então, tem uma hora que a gente sai, digamos, da região uniforme e plana, livre e ampla, defendida por todos, por uma região controversa, em que há riscos, em que há ameaças, em que há situações em que talvez os governos tenham que agir com mais firmeza ou menos firmeza, ou com autorregulação ou não. Então, a minha pergunta primeira para o Bertrand, enquanto esperamos aí também a contribuição dos internautas que estão nos acompanhando, é se o projeto envolve essa taxonomia que pudesse separar camadas específicas de discussão para que a gente não estivesse numa coisa pantanosa, né, de difícil definição, em que os contra-argumentos pudessem ser usados, porque estamos numa área tão ampla em que você não tem definição do objetivo. Então, se você está numa área ampla, os contra-argumentos são fáceis de soltar. Eu certamente sou a favor de que o e-mail preserve-se inviolável, sempre fui. Agora, o e-mail é uma construção internet original, onde você não tem uma plataforma específica que é dona daquilo. Você faz e-mail com quem você quiser, é um RFC específico que define o que é o e-mail. Então, isso não é algo que depende de construções sobre a internet, isso é quase inerente à rede. Agora, quando você discute redes sociais, você está num outro ambiente, e só para terminar isso aí, quando você fala de localização de dados, isso também é algo extremamente fluido, porque o que é a nuvem? Onde estão os dados nacionais? Às vezes os próprios dados nacionais não estão na nação. Então, isso é uma coisa muito complicada e certamente precisa de discussão e certamente essa iniciativa é muito bem-vinda, tentar botar uma certa ordem nessa coisa toda e tentar encontrar caminhos. Então, eu deixo para o Bertrand essa primeira vocação sobre taxonomia e se tem como dividir isso aí em camadas que possam ser atacadas, como a internet é feita em camadas, se podemos tratar a datasphere também em camadas. Obrigado.
I like the question very much, and it's funny you mentioned this because I remember in one of the first IGFs, somebody who worked at Cisco at the time called Art Rayleigh, was a good friend, told me something that has always stayed with me, which is the first basis for any discussion is to have a common vernacular. If people don't understand what they say when they use a particular word, there's a huge amount of misunderstanding. So I completely agree. What is very interesting with the notion of data is when you say data, people are visualizing things that are completely different. For some people, it's the zeros and ones in the packets. And this is very neutral. I mean, this is flowing and it is indiscriminate in a certain way. And you have a whole chain, a value chain, as I was mentioning, that you can aggregate this data. So you have raw data, it can be aggregated, it can be analyzed. Then you get information, then you get knowledge, then you get even decision-making support, etc. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, data is multidimensional. And one of the challenges of taxonomy, in addition to metrics that I mentioned, is that the frontiers are overlapping. So even the simple distinction between personal and non-personal data, as I mentioned, is more fuzzy. And for anyone who likes mathematics, fuzzy logic is much more adapted to this discussion than anything else. Again, at the risk of being pedantic, there's a word and a concept that I am extremely fond of to describe the complexity of the interactions, which is the notion of a hypergraph. I don't get into details now, but the problem is that one particular data set has numerous dimensions in terms of what is the nature of the data set. Is it a bunch of videos? Is it text? Is it a spreadsheet? Whatever. But you have also, where does it come from? What is the operator that is using it? Does it have a license that is attached to it, etc.? And so in the idea of a taxonomy, it is probably more looking at the multiple dimensions of data rather than trying to make categories that are separate. And as a matter of fact, there is a similarity with what I was saying about jurisdiction. The current structure of the world is not just the nation states. It's an oversimplification. It's a one-dimensional projection of the complexity of human relations. And the structure of humanity is itself a hypergraph where everybody belongs to multiple stakeholderships. We are citizens, but we have a gender, we have an age range, we have a field of interest, we are using one particular tool or another. And all those dimensions are something that is extremely difficult for the policy-making system that we have today to grapple with. So taxonomy, yes, but in the direction of probably identifying what are the relevant dimensions of data. And as I said before, location is a very fuzzy question because of technologies such as sharding, where a given operator is actually distributing pieces of data all around the world to serve their users better, balance the load, increase resilience, etc. So the location of data is one of the criteria that people naturally think of when they say things like some political actors. The data of my citizens need to be stored and processed in my country. That is a reductionist approach because the value can be exported at the same time. It can be processed there, but the value is created elsewhere. And sometimes for reasons of security, countries that do not have the infrastructure need to be able to access infrastructure that is located somewhere else. This is why it is so important that we keep the flow with the modicum of trust. I want to do another quick element, which is, you mentioned at the beginning the question of scale and the comparison with the telegraph and the telephone. What is very interesting and probably specific to the era that we live in is the telephone and the telegraph were initially point-to-point things. And the information that was circulated was not stored and retrievable afterwards. And it was not duplicable. And it was not an infrastructure that was actually underpinning absolutely every single activity. We were using, everybody progressively used the telephone, but in the space of 20 years, our data-driven society are absolutely dependent on the use of data because the data sphere actually underpins and reflects increasingly most of the human activities. And one of the challenges is that when we talk about privacy, but it can come in many flavors, the question is, how much do we use the analogies of the analog world to transpose what you said about the letters and the protection of the private messages? But what is new in there? And interestingly enough, you describe the two ends of the spectrum, like broadcast, traditional media, television, or newspapers, which is basically an editorial responsibility, and the private messaging that is closer to the letters. But the whole environment of social media is a new type of thing that is in between, hence the whole problem of content moderation. And the enormous amount of applications of non-personal industrial data is enormous, because there are questions regarding agricultural data. Who should benefit from the data that is being collected by tractors, for instance? Is it John Deere, or is it also the person who is in the field? What do you do with data that is collected in an autonomous vehicle, in a car? Where is it stored? How can it be used also for smart cities to improve the traffic and so on? So one element to finish on the thing is that, again, the analogies are very useful to say that's how we did it in the past. And to a certain extent, it remains an inspiration. But there are things that are new, and particularly the fact that this is a new type of good that is replicable at no cost, that can be reused by a lot of actors without depleting the resources, etc., is something that we have not yet grappled, and we need to understand the consequences. So understanding and dealing with this in terms of complex system dynamics is one of the key challenges, and we hope that the concept of the data sphere will bring a sort of overarching perspective to a lot of different issues.
Muito bem, muito obrigado pela resposta. Eu acho que é exatamente isso que que pensamos como fazer essa viagem através desse mundo complexo e complicado. Eu concordo de fato que as analogias do passado preservam modelos do passado, mas eu, na verdade, queria preservar, digamos, direitos, né? Certamente, eu acho que o meu direito à privacidade nas conversas particulares deve ser preservado, mesmo que haja como duplicar, mesmo que sejam guardadas em alguns lugares. Eu gostaria que fossem preservadas esse direito, sabendo que o mundo hoje permite que isso seja duplicado a custo zero e guardado em diversos lugares misteriosos, mas eu queria preservar o direito. Eu vou fazer algumas perguntas. Eu vou fazer o seguinte, para não quebrar, eu vou fazer em português, a Isadora está nos traduzindo as perguntas para o português, algumas estão em português, algumas estão em inglês. Se a pergunta ficar confusa em português por algum motivo, às vezes tem um detalhe específico que se perde na tradução, eu vou pedir que a Isadora repita em inglês se for necessário. Se o Bertrand achar que está confortável do jeito que está, fica em português e seguimos por aí. A primeira é do Evalt, que é um professor da USP. É uma provocação, não é uma pergunta. Ele diz o seguinte: estamos acostumados a ouvir que os dados são o petróleo. O que ele quer sugerir é que faça-se uma nova analogia, dizendo que os dados são, na verdade, uma espécie de refúgio nuclear, no seguinte sentido: os dados pessoais, como em qualquer processo nuclear, acabam sendo guardados em algum lugar. É impossível você mantê-los guardados eternamente sem que vazem, então vão acabar vazando de alguma forma ou outra. Então, isso é um caveat, é um alerta dele, imagino eu, essa provocação, e que mesmo que a gente jure de pés juntos que guardaremos isso da melhor forma possível, isso acabará vazando, e a analogia dele, então, é com essa história de vazamento de dados que são radioativos e acabam vazando a uma certa altura do campeonato. Eu vou aproveitar e fazer a segunda também, e daí o Bertrand trata dos dois. A segunda é bem na linha do Datasphere, é do Marcos, e ele pergunta como dá para casar, ou como é afetado o princípio de não ingerência na soberania de Estados, quando algumas nações pretendem ter alcance global no que fazem. E aí, acho que o Bertrand até já comentou isso, e acho que é fundamental que ele comentou, temos que pensar o que aconteceria se os outros fizessem o que eu faço. Quer dizer, se as outras nações fizessem o que eu tento fazer, eu ficaria feliz ou infeliz com isso, e como é que isso serve de exemplo. Eu anexaria a isso um comentário meu, também gostaria que o Bertrand comentasse ou não, quando eu falei da história até onde vai o alcance, digamos, do poderio nacional, da soberania. Eu entendo que os cidadãos de um país estão sujeitos às leis do país, com direitos e deveres definidos na Constituição do país. Por exemplo, aqui no Brasil, por exemplo, o jogo é proibido. Então, se você pegar um brasileiro jogando, ele está contrariando uma lei nacional que diz que o jogo é proibido. Se o brasileiro jogar pela internet num outro país, no outro país o jogo eventualmente é permitido. A internet é um treco transfronteiras, então não sei onde termina a soberania e onde não termina. Evidente, se o Brasil, né, flagrar, né, aquele sujeito brasileiro jogando, ele vai dizer: você está violando a lei brasileira porque você está jogando. Mas ele vai dizer: não, mas se eu tivesse viajado para tal país, eu estaria jogando lá sem violar a lei nenhuma. Então, de fato, é uma coisa complicada de você colocar, digamos, limites claros. Ele diz: não, até aí é soberania nacional e você está, digamos, flagrado, foi observado fazendo algo ilegal no nosso país, mesmo que você estivesse fazendo, na verdade, via internet em outro país. Então, essa é exatamente ilustrando o que o próprio Bertrand falou, dessa dificuldade que nós temos hoje de definir soberania. Então, essas duas perguntas, seu comentário inicial para o Bertrand, e se ele quiser alguma coisa que fala em inglês, podemos falar em inglês, mas tudo bem.
Yeah, thank you. I saw the comments. I will not belabor too much on the data is the new nuclear waste. It is a perfect other illustration of what I was saying about the analogies. It's an additional one that I had not heard about, and like all the others, it has its useful insights and the limits also of transposition, because it's not only that. And to give you a funny example, we even found an article that mentioned, and the title was "Data is the New Avocado." And I was thinking, what do you mean by the new avocado? And the explanation was that it may have a shelf life, that sometimes the data has an expiration date where it's not relevant anymore afterwards. So what is interesting in all those analogies, as long as we don't stick with them too much, is that it is a way to look at it. And I don't exclude that in the course of the work we do for the data sphere, we try to make a sort of compendium of all those things and look at what are the different dimensions and learnings that we have. But thanks for sharing it. The second question is, of course, a very important one, and the argument that I was making and that I really deeply believe in is that the international architecture is based on this principle of non-interference, because in most of the times in the past, the number of cross-border interactions was actually relatively limited. You had goods and services, and you handled this by trade. You had personal travel, and people were basically not traveling that much abroad. In our deeply interconnected societies, an architecture that is intended to address problems by separating the sovereignties and dealing exclusively with the territorial dimension of jurisdiction is very badly adapted to something where we have to manage common spaces and cooperation. And the reality is that the notion of non-interference has to be refined because, to a large extent, there are many situations where it is necessary to develop national laws with some degree of extraterritorial impact or dimension. Because, for instance, if you want something that is applicable to a provider that is providing services in your country but doesn't have its headquarters nor any personnel in your country, the traditional system of international law doesn't give you, as a government, any power to have influence. Now, that doesn't mean that you will impose on all the citizens of another country your own laws. But sometimes it may lead to that. There is a very interesting question that we've been addressing, but of course not solved, which is the following. If you are a video sharing platform that is based in France, where there are special legislation, perfectly justified because of the history of France, that says denial of Holocaust is a criminal offense in France. Does that mean that a platform that is based in France, for instance, Dailymotion, which is a real platform that exists for video sharing, does that mean that no international user can post on a platform that is based in France something that is contrary to the French law? An American could use this platform and basically post something that is perfectly legal in the US, but that would be criminal in France. Is the fact that this is a French platform meaning that nobody in the world should use this? In other words, if you have a social media platform that is based in Saudi Arabia, can it go global and impose Saudi Arabia law to anybody that is using this platform? Probably not. On the other hand, it is normal that this content that may be legal somewhere else is filtered by that platform in the territory of France where it is illegal. But does that mean that no such content should be stored on a server that is based in France, even if the company is taking all the measures so that this content is not accessible in France? That's a very interesting question. So extraterritoriality, as we saw for the GDPR, for instance, doesn't impose the rules of data protection of France or Europe upon Brazilians or others, but imposes it on any platform or operator that would be in Brazil that deals with European data. And little by little, if platforms want to harmonize the way they treat this information, they have a tendency to align to one common standard. And the hope of the European Union is that the privacy protection that they've set up will actually spread to a certain extent. And some platforms have adopted this position. So finishing on the question of non-interference, as I mentioned in the presentation, I strongly believe in the notion of responsible exercise of sovereignty. There are situations where it is absolutely legitimate for legislation at the national level to actually have an extraterritorial dimension, but according to the Kantian principle of categoric imperative, you need to take into account this, which allows me to bridge, actually, if you don't mind, one question that was lower and that addressed the question of what are the international organizations where this should be addressed. One thing that needs to be avoided at all costs is the battle of institutions that will try to say, this is my topic and it is not yours. Each of them has a particular angle that needs to be taken into account in the picture. And so this is why in the DataSphere initiative and in the work of INJ in general, we always include the secretariats of international organizations in the discussions that we hold. They're not just observers, they're full stakeholders among the 6 categories that we have. And in the DataSphere initiative, it is absolutely critical that we engage the WTO, and we already do, the WTO, the OECD, it can be the Council of Europe because of the privacy legislation, the European Commission, the UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the African Union, in addition to governments. The G7 is a structure that is not a formal international organization, but it edicts a certain number of approaches and rules. There's a need for coordination, and when we talk about bridging silos, that's the way to bridge silos. The goal is to bring all the different actors. I didn't even mention the World Bank, but the World Bank regarding development has a keen interest in how data is going to be used for development. The United Nations is dealing with this in a lot of its programs around the SDGs. So the key answer is any relevant international organization should be part of the debate, just like the debate should be open also to the different regions that at the moment are more on the receiving end of the legislations and regulations that are adopted in the global north.
Muito bom. Eu faria comentário pessoal em cima do que foi dito, das instituições que podem ser sede para essa discussão, e a analogia que eu faria seria, por exemplo, com o IGF, né? O IGF é um fórum de discussão bastante rico, vai ter um agora em Katowice, na Polônia, e não gera decisões, de alguma forma ilumina decisões que podem ser tomadas depois por órgãos intergovernamentais ou governamentais. Uma outra analogia parecida, mais antiga, né, sobre forma de gerar padrões na internet, por exemplo, seria a analogia entre a forma tradicional de padrões em telecomunicação, que é feita pela ITU, pela União Internacional de Telecomunicações, e a forma que o IETF, e o IAB, etc., e ESG, geraram os padrões da internet, que é com 3 reuniões anuais de ampla discussão, onde tudo isso é debatido e tudo mais. Eu tendo, né, e aí eu pergunto para o Bertrand, eu tendo a achar que a coisa é mais frutífera se de fato for algo multissetorial, né, com todos os envolvidos no processo sendo ouvidos, porque certamente a área técnica tem coisas a dizer, a área acadêmica tem coisas a dizer, a sociedade civil tem coisas a dizer, os governos também têm muita coisa a dizer e têm, digamos, ações a tomar. Mas eu teria medo de tornar essa discussão muito centrada só em órgãos intergovernamentais, porque faltaria, digamos, a luz ou a visão das demais áreas que são importantes no processo. Então, quando foi discutida em que instituição devia se sediar essa discussão, e foram citadas várias delas, eu queria que o Bertrand talvez comentasse isso um pouco, até para dizer do papel do Internet Jurisdiction como ponto focal de várias dessas discussões e como talvez iluminador de outras discussões em áreas mais, digamos, oficiais, né, e mais multigovernamentais, mas que uma decisão, e aí eu vou fazer mais um comentário, quer dizer, em alguns casos nós temos legislações nacionais, em alguns casos na Europa, na Inglaterra, na Alemanha, decisões que, na ânsia de defender, por exemplo, os indivíduos de linguagem de ódio, de coisas, exigem certas atitudes dos provedores ou do pessoal do meio do caminho que acabam gerando efeitos colaterais muito danosos. Então, essa história de que para você ter mais proteção devemos diminuir o grau de liberdade disponível na rede, eu acho que é uma coisa altamente, digamos, perigosa na área. Por isso que eu acho que é importante que sejam ouvidos todos os atores envolvidos no processo, desde o pessoal da área técnica, o pessoal acadêmico e tudo mais, para que depois os órgãos internacionais possam tentar harmonizar decisões. E aí eu vou aproveitar uma outra pergunta que foi dita aí, qual é a possibilidade de haver uma harmonia nisso? Porque a gente sabe que as culturas são diferentes, os meios culturais de nações, de povos são diferentes. Então, o que pode, foi muito bem dito, o que parece razoável num lugar, pode ser extremamente não razoável em outro lugar. Como chegar ao mínimo comum, mínimo denominador comum, máximo denominador comum, em que nós tivéssemos o melhor resultado que todos aceitassem. A gente sabe que leis internacionais são muito difíceis de se obter. Então, teria que ser uma coisa tipo soft law, lei digamos, fraca, mas mais conceitual. Na verdade, eu sinto falta, e eu acho que isso é uma coisa que a internet tem diluído, dos conceitos tradicionais que nós tínhamos embutidos na nossa cabeça pela formação que nossa família, nossas avós nos deram e tudo mais. Isso está sendo diluído nessa discussão ampla, e eu acho que isso falta quando você quer chegar a um consenso geral do que é honesto, do que é correto, do que é adequado, mesmo sabendo que culturalmente isso é difícil de se definir. Mas enquanto eu vejo outras perguntas específicas, eu passo a bola para o Bertrand comentar sobre isso. Obrigado.
Well, thanks for the very appropriate question. I cannot hope to give in a few minutes of answer the solution to what is the core problem. Let me just provide a few elements speaking from what you're saying. First of all, I have been converted to the multi-stakeholder approach, whatever we name it, which is, whatever the name, the fundamental element is the right of any person or entity to participate in an appropriate manner in the governance processes that deal with the issues that they are impacted by or that they impact. I think that's the overarching question. And you were making the reference to my comment about the change and the bet that was to believe in universal suffrage. It was completely unconscionable at the time to believe that non-educated people could have a say in the electoral process. With all the limitations, it worked quite well, and at least better than autocracies in general. I think for the multi-stakeholder approach, under the definition that I was giving, it's a little bit the same. It is a very strange bet, because normally there's this tendency to think that it is just the province of states. The fact is that in the 10 years, almost 10 years that we've been, that I've been running Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, I know that it works. I know that it works to put people around the table because they do progress. It takes time, which is normal. It raises very important questions of how can you be both inclusive and having processes that are manageable? Because being inclusive doesn't mean that the doors are open to absolutely anybody at any time. There are moments where you need to collect as much information as possible on a topic. And then there are moments where you need to distill this information, negotiate potential frameworks, and have them validated, maybe by a limited number of actors. We are pushing, in general, the notion of policy standards. And there are many things that can be inspiring in terms of bringing a group of actors to elaborate what is the distributions of rights and responsibilities between the different actors. I believe that the tool of pure, that's personal, but I believe that the tool of pure regulation is reaching limits, because in many cases, the implementation of the regulation will require the cooperation in the digital space of the major private operators. And if you need them in the implementation, you will need to have them in the drafting of what the solution is. And so it's a little bit of a play on words, but you remember that before the IANA function in ICANN was made independent from the NTIA in the US, there was this affirmation of commitment, which I found was a very interesting formulation. And I strongly believe that we need a new type of international, or I would say rather a new type of transnational instrument that I personally call mutual affirmation of commitments. i.e. there are framework, a little bit like framework conventions, where the different actors, civil society, governments, of course, civil society and private entities, define what is the distribution of responsibilities between them to address a problem. And I want to make a bridge to one of the questions that was in the chat regarding how to fight. What was the element? The fight about criminal activities and basically, yes, punishment of offenses across borders. We have a problem in common, which is that transnational is the new normal. And what I was talking about earlier of the difference between a situation when you can work with very nicely separated governments and moving to an environment where transnational is the new normal and you need structures to address this, and you need to do it in a multi-stakeholder manner, there is an institutional vacuum. And I think we're reaching a phase where the awareness of the need for institutional innovation is becoming clear. We need new formats for interactions and for coordination, not for regulating at the global level, but to develop those frameworks of coexistence and cooperation. And I want to address one point that you, in that regard, that you mentioned, which is, are we aiming collectively at harmonization, at a common minimum standard, etc.? I don't believe we will, I don't believe we should, and I don't even believe we can. The answer for us, and I've been pushing this notion for several years now, is the notion of interoperability between governance systems. So let me explain just briefly. If you look at the internet, you have a collection of completely heterogeneous networks, and they are bound together in an interoperable manner through a protocol, which is the TCP/IP. And that produces the internet. The World Wide Web is the same. You have a collection of heterogeneous databases. I don't care if it is on Oracle, MySQL, or whatever, but you have a common protocol that basically says, as long as you respect the HTML, HTTP protocol, you can connect in an interoperable manner your heterogeneous databases, and then it becomes the World Wide Web. When you look at the landscape of governance, we have a collection of heterogeneous governance systems. Any human group that exists has its own governance. For the states, it can be a republic, a monarchy, a very traditional other structure, but any other group has its own rules. Any association has its own internal rules. Any company on the internet has its own terms of service. Any football club has its own internal rules. All these things are governance structures. These governance structures are heterogeneous, and what we need is to develop the governance protocols that will allow a level of interoperability between those actors, not by harmonizing their norms and their rules, but by respecting a minimum of rules of interaction. And to answer the question of how to produce cooperation in addressing offenses internationally, you know that the three programs that we're running, one is about access to electronic evidence in criminal investigations across border. The other one is about content moderation across border. And the third one is about how to address DNS abuse. Each of the three is actually addressing one single common question, which is, how do we cooperate across borders between public and private actors to prevent, address, and remediate abuse? And this can only be done if we have rules of coordination and rules of communication. What is the format for request for access to electronic evidence? How do you notify that a content is illegal? What is the geographic scope that you want this content to be removed? How do you address phishing? How do you address malware? All those issues require that we think in terms of interoperability between governance frameworks, and not only between states. It needs to be between states, but also between states and other actors in this notion of mutual affirmation of commitments.
Muito bom. Eu vou voltar a uma pergunta que você já respondeu e juntar com a pergunta da Raquel, que é uma adicional, a pergunta da Jaqueline perguntava em que instituições isso seria tratado melhor. Você já deu uma lista delas, mas eu vou aproveitar e reforçar com a pergunta da Raquel, dizendo em qual delas você acha que a coisa está mais crítica, quer dizer, onde provavelmente essa discussão vai começar com mais força. Em qual das organizações internacionais que nós conhecemos hoje, aparentemente esse assunto estará mais ligado digamos, à agenda do dia. Se vai ser em alguma coisa ligada na OECD ou nas Nações Unidas, quer dizer, onde você acha que isso afetará mais, para responder, digamos, a pergunta da Raquel combinada com a pergunta da Jaqueline. E tem mais uma que eu farei depois, aí acho que estamos bem encaminhados. Obrigado.
I can only reiterate what I said, and I saw that Raquel has mentioned the question again in the chat. We need to turn. It's always the same challenge. How to turn a problem into the way to find a solution. You know, in French, we have an expression that says "faire de nécessité vertu," which is transform what is a constraint or an obligation into a virtue. And here, the necessity is that because data is multidimensional, because it touches upon trade, upon privacy, upon security, upon all economic dimensions, it is normal that existing institutions and existing actors, it's not only international organizations, but existing actors, look at the problem from one particular angle. And as we're talking about privacy, we all know that the great progress that the GDPR has represented in Europe regarding raising the standard of privacy has also unintended consequences in many security dimensions on the side, and it was not potentially taken into account sufficiently enough at the beginning. So each actor, each international organization that is looking at the problem related to data from their particular mandate is legitimate. It's normal that the WTO deals with what do we do with data in trade. It is normal that the OECD deals with what do we do with data in terms of the economic growth and innovation and so on. What becomes interesting, though, is because of the interconnection between the different dimensions, even the OECD is now addressing the question of access to user data in criminal investigations. So what should be the message? This is not your remit and you shouldn't do it? Or, oh, now that you've picked it, let's put in the OECD the whole solution for criminal investigations? No. They need to be around the table so that the interconnection between the different problems are addressed. And on a case-by-case basis, maybe only some of them will be relevant. Or maybe the collective dialogue that we're trying to foster will allow to distribute some responsibilities. So maybe somebody will take the lead on one thing, but associate the others. And something comes to mind as we're speaking. You may remember, Demi, that in the World Summit on the Information Society, it was mainly organized at the time in 2003-05 jointly by UNESCO and the ITU within the UN system. And in the UN system, there is a body that is called the Chief Executive Board, which brings together all the heads, Secretary General, Director General of the different international organizations in the UN system. And I think there is a connection also with the other organizations like Bretton Woods and others from time to time. What was very interesting is that this Chief Executive Board has a format that says on special issues, it's one or two of the organizations that basically become the chairs of the Chief Executive Board in a new composition is the same people. But when it deals with one particular topic, it can be on labor issues, maybe it's the ILO that will take the lead. And for the World Summit on the Information Society, there was this format that was called UNGIS. And it was nothing else than the Chief Executive Board, but under the joint leadership at the time of UNESCO and ITU. So when we're talking about the coordination between international organizations, maybe on a topic-by-topic basis, one entity would take the lead and another one be just part of the working group that is dealing with that. Coordination is the key. And in terms of access to electronic evidence, for instance, we had a discussion no later than this morning with UNODC, which is based in Vienna. But there's another entity in New York called CTED that deals with terrorism. So you have the ones in Vienna that deals with criminal organizations for drug trafficking and so on, and the other ones would deal with terrorism. They work together and they distribute the responsibilities on a topic-by-topic basis. And I think that I could not emphasize enough the need for not getting in a battle of who is going to be the one that deals with this topic, because it is a cross-silo topic. And it is one of the major challenges. And one of the hopes is that, as we've experienced in the past 10 years, the fact that Internet and Jurisdiction, and particularly now the Datasphere Initiative, is something that is neither a government nor an international organization nor a private sector or other, we have a form of neutral capacity to tell people, well, we're just a convener. Let's get around the table and then you will distribute the responsibilities. So that's what we hope to do. And that's why talking about the data sphere is showing that it touches upon trade, privacy, criminal justice, and so on, but it's all of these topics seen from a more systemic approach. And then we can discuss what are the subtopics that need to be addressed and who is relevant in those texts. But this change of perspective, this sort of conceptual framework is, I see something that people have an appetite for. We see the reaction of people that, and I will not name the country just to finish, we had a very good interaction with somebody at a good level in one governmental ministry. And one of the people who was working with this interlocutor was a director, after a presentation of the Datasphere Initiative, basically said, it is wonderful because you can do things we cannot do. Because we have so many things that have to be done on a daily basis that is extremely difficult to step back. And it is great that there is something that allows us to think in a broader term. So we're trying to frame, and as the report was saying, it's reframing the problem and providing a new conceptual framework. But cooperation is the name of the game.
Muito bem. Nós estamos chegando perto do final já da apresentação. Eu vou fazer a pergunta 8 da Carolina, porque ela de alguma forma é uma provocação e que permitirá ao Bertrand fechar a apresentação com os comentários dele sobre como achou a apresentação toda e recomendar a gente quais são os próximos passos, além, eventualmente, da minha recomendação, que é acessar o sítio da Internet Jurisdiction e baixar um monte de textos que tem lá, de relatórios que tem lá, que são extremamente úteis. Então, eu já estou avisando que existe o site, o sítio que a Internet Jurisdiction tem, com excelentes relatórios para serem usados nisso. Mas vou aproveitar o final da resposta do Bertrand para fazer a provocação que a Carolina faz, que é a seguinte. Digamos que nós vamos tentar equilibrar o livre fluxo de dados e o direito de soberania. Será que isso conseguirá ser feito de uma forma neutra e, digamos, equânime, dado que existe um descompasso entre o poderoso norte e o sul, e aí nesse descompasso entra certamente tecnologia, que mora mais em certos lugares, entram certamente plataformas que têm base em alguns lugares e em outros não. Em suma, é uma provocação aí da Carolina, mas vai na linha do que foi comentado pelo Bertrand, da interação entre as nações. Conseguiremos fazer isso de uma forma, digamos, neutra e equânime, sem piorar descompassos que eventualmente já existem, porque existe uma realidade tecnológica, uma realidade econômica, uma realidade política. Então, eu repasso essa pergunta final para ele e peço que, então, faça aí os seus comentários sobre essa excelente palestra que ele deu a todos nós. Obrigado.
Well, it was a great opportunity to float a certain number of ideas, and this is a very good question to finish. Quick remark on this. One, I now have a systematic effort whenever I see people using in presentations or in questions the word to balance, to not correct, but to highlight that when we use balance, words matter, and we very often believe that there is something that has to be paid to get more of something by having less of another. And the notion and the typical debate is, how do you balance privacy and security? I'm sorry, there are many, many, many situations where they both go hand in hand. And you can increase privacy and increase security at the same time. Not always. But in many cases, we favor the term, how do we reconcile competing objectives? And reconciling competing objectives is exactly what is there. We want the free flow of data because, as I mentioned, let me reformulate. We want actually the maximum opportunities for the sharing of data when it creates more social and economic value. And in that regard, I insist always on the social and economic dimension, because in many cases, people focus only on the economic value creation. It goes for copyright, it goes for privacy, it goes for the control and the licensing of access to data, etc. But in many cases, the question of maximizing the social and economic value, in several cases, it can go both. And sometimes you have to balance social and economic value, because if you want more social value, you have a little bit less economic value. But let me remind everybody in that regard that in the early years, when people were proposing the creation of public libraries, the publishers, the book publishers, were adamantly opposed to this notion because they thought that nobody would buy books. The actual result was that everybody became more literate and that the number of books has skyrocketed. So there are many situations where private data can be shared for public interest uses, for governments or other associations. And likewise, there are many situations where public data can be used for developing private applications. So I always try to insist on the notion that it's not always just balancing, it is reconciling. That being said, the question of the situation between the global north and the global south, and here we need to be a little bit also go a little bit deeper, because even within the global north, a lot of the concerns that I was mentioning earlier are felt by, for instance, European countries vis-a-vis the dominant position of most American-based platforms. And I don't even put in the landscape the question of the emergence of China. But what is true is that one of the key challenges is that the dynamics of the digital economy have a tendency to increase inequalities in distribution of wealth. And second, that because of the position of the operators, particularly in the US, but also in China now, because of the normative power of a region like the European Union, a lot of actors in the global south are actually under the feeling that they have no control on their future in that regard. And this is why there is a need to, one, have the voices of those regions early in the processes, in the dialogues that we're talking about. And in the context of the Datasphere Initiative, we are just starting, we started last week, a massive effort for 2 years, in the next 2 years, vis-à-vis Africa, in partnership with the development ministry in Germany and the African Union, to map and organize a dialogue on cross-border digital policies in Africa. And we already had, as you know, done with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, a similar effort 2 years ago by producing the global status, the regional status report for Latin America and the Caribbean, and it was written by Carlos Afonso, that you know well. And so including the voices of countries in the global south in the debate about what is the digital society we want is absolutely fundamental. And the question of, I wouldn't say balance, but rebalancing the inequalities that have been produced is going to be one of the key elements. And as I said before, reconciling is possible sometimes, because rebalancing the economic and social benefit so that the value that is created is more equally distributed is a great ambition that is actually going to be beneficial for all. And the sort of winner-take-all society and hyper-competitive environment that we've experienced in the early decades of this data revolution, because I'm not even talking about the internet, it's really the last 20 years that I've seen the development. Having the and sorry for the interpreters, because my sentence is becoming so long that they must have lost the track in between. But rebalancing the equitable distribution of social and economic value goes hand in hand with reconciling the interest of the global south and the global north, because this is, and that's maybe a final word, I think the key question is, what is the digital society we want to build? How equitable do we want it to be? And it is fundamentally a civilizational challenge. How do we organize the coexistence of 7 billion, probably soon 8 billion, of people across borders in common digital spaces? And that was one of the questions that we didn't have time to address. Those 7 billion people have extremely different personal, religious, political, cultural references and attachments, and are legitimate, but also political environments in their respective countries. How do you organize, and do we collectively organize, the dialogue to manage the coexistence of those actors and maximize the creation of value for everyone, address the SDGs, fight climate change, but also create the economic incentives for innovation to flourish? And I would say that it is a very exciting challenge, something that, as I mentioned in the presentation, is for me much more positive and driving than just trying to patch one after the other with temporary short-term measures every single topic that is emerging.
Muito bem. Eu acho que tivemos um fecho brilhante e positivo. Certamente o desafio é gigantesco e os remendos pontuais não parecem ser a melhor solução. Tem que se olhar a floresta como um todo para se encontrar os melhores caminhos. Eu agradeço imensamente a presença e a participação do Bertrand de la Chapelle por 1h30 nesse nosso primeiro Keynote Speaker. Aviso o pessoal que o painel 1 começa em outro link. Da mesma forma que a internet é feita por sistemas autônomos, aqui esse seminário vai ser feito por links autônomos. Cada painel terá um link autônomo, mas todos eles se comunicam na mesma ideia de ter um seminário unido. Então, eu convido todos a reaparecerem aqui por volta das 4, no próximo link do painel. E, mais uma vez, deixo um grande abraço e um agradecimento ao Bertrand pelas brilhantes palavras que proferiu e ressalto a parte otimista do fecho dele, e certamente há caminhos para que a gente consiga melhorar o diálogo, respeitando as culturas, as diversidades, as características, as idiosincrasias de cada região, de cada nação, de cada povo, sem que a parte digital se perca e que consigamos tratar disso para o bem geral. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado, agradeço a atenção de todos.
I have to thank you, Demi. I just mentioned in the chat the simpler address, which is thedatasphere.org, if you want to download the report and get this. And just one point, you said I'm optimistic. I would quote Jean Monnet, who said, I'm not optimistic, I'm determined.
Okay. But excellent. And the people don't see the address because they are not at the Zoom. But I will ask Isabel to put the correct address for Datasphere in the iTunes, okay. YouTube. Thank you very much, Bertrand. Very good to meet you again.
My pleasure.
Thank you again. We'll meet soon, if possible, in person.